20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Chapter 11. The Sargasso Sea. No alteration was made in the course of the Nautilus, and all hope of gaining European waters was now gone. Where Captain Nemo was hurrying I could not imagine. That day we crossed a curious portion of the Atlantic. Everyone is acquainted with the existence of the great warm current called the Gulf Stream. Leaving Florida, it follows towards Spitzbergen, but before entering the Gulf of Mexico, about the 44th north latitude, the current divides, one branch going south towards the Irish coast and up to Norway, while the other trends southwards up to the Azores. Then, touching the coast of Africa and describing a long oval, it turns again towards the Antilles. Now, this second arm, or rather collar, surrounds with its warm water the portion of the cold ocean denominated the Sargasso Sea, a veritable lake in the open Atlantic, and it takes the great currents no less than 3 years to encircle it. The Sargasso Sea, properly speaking, covers the submerged Atlantis. Certain authors have even admitted that the herbs with which it is strewn have been torn from the fields of that ancient continent. It is more probable, however, that these algae and fucus, loosed from the coasts of Europe and America, are carried hither by the Gulf Stream. This was one of the reasons why Columbus believed in the existence of a new world. When he arrived in the Sargasso Sea, the ships sailed with difficulty in the midst of the herbs, to the terror of the crews, and it took 3 long weeks to get through them. Such was the region the Nautilus entered, a regular prairie, a carpet of seaweed, fucus and berries, so thick and compact that a vessel could hardly make way through it. Captain Nemo, not wishing to get the screw entangled in the weeds, kept the Nautilus at some distance beneath the surface. This name of Sargasso is derived from the Spanish word sargasso, signifying sea wrack. This wrack or varech is the principal constituent of this immense bank. And the following is the reason, according to Maury, why hydrophytes unite in this peaceful basin in the Atlantic. The only possible explanation, says Maury, seems to me the result of a worldwide experience. If you place in the centre of a vase some fragments of cork or other floating substance, and give to the water a circular motion, the fragments will unite in the centre, in the least agitated part. In the phenomenon we are considering, the vase is the Atlantic, the Gulf Stream is the circular current, and the Sargasso Sea the central point where the floating bodies unite. I agree with Maury, and was enabled to study the phenomenon in the very centre where ships but rarely penetrate. Overhead floated all kinds of products, trunks of trees torn from the Andes or Rocky Mountains, and floated out to sea by the Amazon or the Mississippi. Numerous wrecks, keels and hulls, and planks so heavy with shells and barnacles as to be unable to float on the surface. And time will justify Maury in his other opinion, that these accumulations of centuries will petrify and form inexhaustible coal fields, a valuable reserve which nature is preparing for the time when continental coal mines shall be exhausted. In the midst of this tangled mass of plants and fucus, I noticed some beautiful rose halcyon trailing their long tentacles, and green, red, and blue medusae, particularly the great rhizostomes of Cuvier, the blue umbrella of which is bordered by a violet fringe. We passed the whole of the 22nd of February in the Sargasso Sea, where the fish, great admirers of marine plants and crustacea, found abundant food. Next day the ocean had assumed its usual appearance. For the next 19 days the Nautilus kept in mid-Atlantic. We proceeded steadily at the rate of 100 leagues in the 24 hours. Captain Nemo was evidently determined to carry out his programme, and I had no doubt that he intended, when he had doubled Cape Horn, to return to the South Pacific. Ned Land had therefore some cause for alarm. In these immense expanses of sea, with but few islands, it would not do to think of escape, nor were there any means to oppose Captain Nemo's wishes. We could only submit, but we might gain by diplomacy what we could not attain by strength or stratagem. Once the voyage was over, would not Captain Nemo restore us our liberty, under an oath never to betray him? Now could I claim this liberty? He had declared that the secret of life entailed in returning our lasting incarceration on board the Nautilus, and would not my silence for 4 months look like a tacit acceptation of the conditions? In fact, I was forced to confess that our chances of seeing our relatives were again diminished more and more from the day Captain Nemo went south again. During the 19 days I have referred to, no incident of any note occurred. I saw but little of the captain. He was at work. In the library I often found his books upon natural history left open. At this part of our voyage we often sailed for whole days at the surface. The sea was, as it were, deserted. A few sailing vessels bound to India via the Cape were all we perceived. One day we were pursued by the boats of a whaler, who no doubt took us for some valuable whale, but Captain Nemo was unwilling that these brave fellows should lose both time and trouble, and so he plunged incontinently into the depths. This incident appeared to interest Ned Land mightily. I rather think he regretted that our iron cetacean had not been captured by the fishermen. The fish we observed here were not greatly different from those we had previously noticed. The principal specimens were various kinds of sharks. We also saw tremendous dogfish, about which many extravagant stories are related by fishermen, one of which was reported to have swallowed 2 pickled tunnies and a sailor, clothes and all, another a soldier fully equipped, and a third a cavalier and his horse complete. But I do not think we can rank the credit of these tales among our articles of faith. At any rate, we caught none, so I could not verify even one story. Troops of dolphins accompanied us for whole days at a time, and I noticed also some curious specimens of the fish of the Acanthopterygian order of the family of cyanoids. Some authors, chiefly poets, pretend that these fish sing, and their voices form quite a concert to which human voices cannot compare. I do not deny this, but at any rate we were not serenaded by them, and I am sorry for it. We also saw quantities of flying fish. Nothing can be more curious than to see the dolphins giving chase with such wonderful precision. No matter how the unfortunate fish flew, or what course he took, even across the Nautilus, he always dropped into the mouth of his pursuer. Up to the 13th of March, our voyage continued like this. On that day, we took some soundings which interested me particularly. We had made nearly 13,000 leagues since our departure from the Pacific high seas. The bearings we took gave us 45 degrees 37 minutes south latitude and 37 degrees 53 minutes east longitude. We were in the same locality where Captain Denner of the Harold gave out 14,000 yards of line without touching the bottom. There also Lieutenant Parker of the American frigate Congress did not find soundings at 15,140 yards. Captain Nemo resolved to bring down the Nautilus to the greatest depth to test these different soundings. I made preparation to note the results. The panels were opened, and we set about reaching the depths of the ocean. One might imagine that to dive it was only a question of filling the reservoirs, but perhaps they would not be sufficient. On the other hand, perhaps the pumps were not sufficiently powerful to overcome the exterior pressure. Captain Nemo resolved to get to the bottom by a long diagonal by means of the inclined planes, at the side being I'll start that one again. Captain Nemo resolved to get to the bottom by a long diagonal by means of the inclined planes at the side being placed at an angle of 45 degrees. Then the screw was worked at full speed, and it beat the waves with tremendous violence. Under this tremendous pressure, the Nautilus quivered like a cord and descended straight away into the water. The captain and I, posted in the saloon, followed the movements of the manometer, which moved rapidly. We soon passed the habitable zone in which the greater number of fish live. I asked Captain Nemo whether he had ever observed fish at a very great depth. "Very seldom," he said. "But what does science say?" "It is known," I replied, "that toward the very low depths vegetable life disappears more quickly than the animal, and it is known that where even animated beings are met with no vegetation is observable but hydrophyte. It is known that pelerines and oysters live at 2,000 yards underwater, and that Captain McClintock, the polar hero, has brought up a living starfish from the depth of 2,500 yards. The nets of the Bulldog of the Royal Navy fished up an asteroid from 2,620 fathoms. But, Captain Nemo, perhaps you will say that they know nothing about it?" "No, Professor, I should not be so rude. And moreover, I should like you to explain how these things are able to live at such great depths." "I can give you 2 reasons," I replied. "First, because the vertical currents, determined by the difference in the saltiness and density of the water, produce a movement which is sufficient to give a rudimentary life on the ecrines and asteroids." "Quite so," replied the captain. "Secondly, because if oxygen be the basis of life, we know that the quantity of oxygen contained in the sea increases with the depth instead of diminishing, and that the pressure helps to compress it." "Ah, they know that," said the captain in a light tone of surprise. "Well, they are right. I will add that the swimming bladders of fish contain more azote than oxygen when the animal is near the surface, and more oxygen than azote when at a great depth. That gives your system probability. But let us continue our observations." My gaze was fixed on the manometer. The instrument indicated a depth of 6,000 yards. We had been immersed for an hour, and the Nautilus was still descending. The water was beautifully clear. An hour later we had reached 13,000 yards, about 3¼ leagues, and the bottom of the ocean had not yet been attained. At 14,000 yards I saw some black peaks rising up, but these summits appeared to be those of mountains as high as the Himalayas or Mont Blanc, or higher, and the depths appeared as far off as ever. The Nautilus still descended, notwithstanding the tremendous pressure. I felt it tremble, and the bolts seemed to start. The partitions groaned, and the windows of the saloon seemed to cave in with the enormous pressure, and the whole thing would have given way, had it not been, as the captain had said, capable of resisting any possible pressure, like a solid block of iron. The last remnants of animal life soon disappeared, and at 3 leagues down the Nautilus had passed the limits of submarine existence. We had attained a depth of 16,000 yards, 4 leagues, and the side of the Nautilus bore the pressure of 6,000 atmospheres, or 2,000 pounds, for each 2/5 of an inch square of its surface. "What a position!" I cried, "sailing through these profundities where humankind has never been. Look at those splendid rocks, Captain, those uninhabited grottos, the last receptacles of the earth where life is impossible. What unknown sights are here, and how impossible is it that we should retain any souvenir of them?" "Would it please you to have a souvenir of them?" asked Captain Nemo. "What do you mean?" "I mean that nothing is easier than to take a photograph of this submarine view." I had no time to express my surprise, for at a summons from Captain Nemo the apparatus was brought in. The water was electrically illuminated, and the perfectly distributed light could not have been surpassed by the sun's rays. The Nautilus, under the pressure of her screw, and overcome by the inclined planes, remained steady. The camera was fixed, and in a few seconds we had obtained a beautiful negative. I can only give thee positive proof here. The primitive rocks, which have never met heaven's light, The lower granite strata which form the foundations of the earth, the deep grottos included in these stony masses, those clear profiles with black edges. Then, beyond a horizon of mountains, an admirable undulating line which makes the perspective of the picture. I cannot describe this assemblage of smooth, black and polished rocks, and of the strange forms which glittered beneath the gleam of our electric light. When Captain Nemo had finished, he said, "Let us ascend now. We must not go too far, nor expose the Nautilus to such a pressure." "Ascend again?" I said. "Hold tight, I advise you," said he. "I had no time to understand this caution when I was thrown upon the floor." The screw was hauled in, the inclined planes pointed upwards, and the Nautilus, carried up like a balloon, rose with fearful rapidity. It cut through the waters with a roar. Nothing whatever was visible as we ascended. In 4 minutes we had passed the 4 leagues which lay between us and the surface, and after emerging from the water like a flying fish, we fell back to float upon the waves, making the billows rise to a prodigious height as we did so. Chapter 12. Cachalots and Whales. During the night of the 13th of March, the Nautilus steered towards the south. I thought that when Captain Nemo had got to the latitude of Cape Horn, he would put the helm up for the Pacific and complete his tour of the world. But he did not, and still kept his southerly course. Whither was he bound? To the pole? That was madness. I really began to think that the captain's rashness sufficiently justified the apprehensions of Ned Land. The Canadian had not spoken to me respecting his plans of escape for some time. He had become less communicative, almost silent. I perceived how this long imprisonment preyed upon him. I felt that he was bottling up his indignation. Whenever he met the captain, his eyes gleamed with a fierce light, and I was always fearful that his violent temperament would impel him to some rash action. On that day, the 14th of March, Conseil and he came to see me in my room. I inquired the object of this visit. "To ask a simple question, monsieur," replied the Canadian. "Speak, Ned." "How many men do you think there are on board the Nautilus?" "I cannot tell you, my friend," I replied. "It seems to me," said Ned, "that she does not require a large crew to work her." "As a matter of fact, under present circumstances, 10 men would suffice," I replied. "Well, why should there be any more?" said Ned. "Why?" I asked. I looked steadily at Ned, whose ideas were not difficult to fathom. "Because," I continued, "if my presentiments are correct, and I have understood the captain, the Nautilus is not merely a ship. It is a refuge for those who, like its commander, have broken all worldly ties." "Perhaps so," replied Conseil, "but it can only contain a certain number of men, and monsieur can give us the maximum." "How so, Conseil?" "By calculation. Given the capacity of the vessel, which monsieur knows, and consequently the quantity of air it can contain, and knowing also how much each individual would require for respiration, and by comparing the result with the recurring necessity for returning to the surface for air every 24 hours. I saw at once what Conseil meant. "I understand," I said, "but such a calculation could give but an uncertain result." "Never mind," insisted Ned Land. "Well, this is the calculation," I said. "Every man in 1 hour consumes the oxygen contained in 20 gallons of air, so in 24 hours that would be 480 gallons. We must now endeavour to find out how many times 480 gallons of air are contained in the Nautilus." "Exactly," said Conseil. "Now," I continued, "the capacity of the Nautilus is 1,500 tons, and that of a ton is 200 gallons. The Nautilus, therefore, contains 300,000 gallons of air, which, divided by 480, gives 625. So the air contained in the Nautilus would suffice for 625 men for 24 hours. 625, repeated Ned. But you may take for granted that, including ourselves, crew and officers, there is not a 10th part of that number on board. But there are still too many for 3 men, muttered Conseil. Therefore, my poor Ned, I said, I can only advise you to be patient. And what is better, be resigned, said Conseil. Conseil had used the right word. After all, he resumed, Captain Nemo cannot always keep going to the south. He must stop somewhere and return into more civilized seas. It will then be time to put Ned Land's plans into action. The Canadian shook his head, passed his hand over his forehead, and went out, but did not answer. Will Monsieur permit me to make an observation? Said Conseil. Poor Ned is ever wanting what he cannot have. All his past life returns to him. He regrets everything that is forbidden to us. Old memories oppress him, and he has a large heart. We must try to understand him. What has he to do here? Nothing. He is not a savant. He cannot take the same pleasure in admiring the sea as we do. He would risk all he possesses to be able to enter an inn in his own country again. It is certain the monotony of ship life had become insupportable to the Canadian, used to an active existence. Events which could rouse him up were rare. However, an incident happened that day which recalled bright days to the harpooner. About 11 a.m., being at the surface, the Nautilus fell in with a school of whales, at which I was not surprised, as I knew that the creatures, hunted to death, seek refuge in high latitudes. The part played by the whale in the marine world, and its influence upon geographical discovery, has been considerable. It is the whale that successively induced the Basques, the Asturians, the English, and the Dutch to accustom themselves to the dangers of the sea, and has led them from one end of the earth to the other. Whales frequent the Arctic and the Antarctic seas. Ancient stories say that these cetaceans have brought fishers to within 7 leagues of the North Pole. If this be not true, it soon will be, and in their chase of the whale, men will reach this unknown point of the globe. We were sitting upon the platform. The sea was calm, but October in these latitudes gave us some lovely autumnal days. The Canadian, he could not err, signalled a whale on the horizon to the east. As we gazed attentively, we could distinguish his black back rising and falling with the sea, about 5 miles from us. "Ah," cried Ned, "if I were only on board a whaler, there is an encounter that would do me good. It is a splendid animal. Look with what force he's spouting. Why am I bound to this iron plate?" "What, Ned?" said I. "Then you have forgotten your old tastes?" Then you have not forgotten your old tastes. Can a whale fisher ever forget his trade, sir? Can the excitement incident to such a chase ever die out? You have never fished in these seas, I suppose? Never, sir. Only in the north, in Bering and Davis Straits, about equally. Then the whale of the southern seas is unknown to you. You have hitherto only hunted the Greenland whale, which would not pass the warm waters of the equator. "Ah, monsieur, what do you mean?" cried Ned in a somewhat incredulous tone. "I am stating a fact." "Well, now, for instance, I myself in 1865, that is 2 years and a half ago, fell in with a whale near Greenland, which carried another harpoon in his side, a harpoon marked as belonging to a Bering whaler. Now, I ask you how, having been struck on the west side of America, the animal could come up to be killed in the east, unless he had doubled the Cape and crossed the equator." "I agree with you, Ned," said Conseil, "and should like to have an explanation." "Whales are localized," I replied, "according to their species, in certain seas which they do not leave, and if one of them did pass from Bering's to Davis Strait, it is simply because some passage must exist beneath Asia or America." "Must we believe that?" asked the Canadian with a wink. "We must believe monsieur," said Conseil. "All right then," said Ned. and as I have never fished in these seas, I do not know the species of whale that frequents them." "I have told you so, Ned." "All the more reason why we should make their acquaintance," replied Conseil. "Look, look!" cried Ned excitedly. "It is coming nearer! It's aggravating! It knows that I cannot get at it!" Ned stamped his foot. His hand shook as if he were brandishing a harpoon. "Are these cetaceans as big as those of the North Seas?" he asked. "Very nearly," I replied. "I have seen whales 100 feet long, and I am told that at the Aleutian Islands they have been known to exceed 150 feet in length." "That seems an exaggeration," I replied. "These animals are only Balaenopterus, provided with dorsal fins, and, like the cachalots, are usually smaller than the Greenland species." "Ah," said the Canadian, whose eyes never left the sea, "it is approaching nearer still." Then, resuming the conversation, he said, "You speak of the cachalot as a small animal, but enormous specimens have been known. They are intelligent cetaceans. Some of them, it is said, cover themselves with seaweed, and are sometimes mistaken for islands. Then people land, and encamp, light a fire, and also build houses on them," added Conseil. "Yes, you joker," replied Ned. "Then, at last, some fine day, the animal takes it into his head to dive, and drowns all the inhabitants." "That's like the travels of Sinbad the Sailor," I said, laughing. Master Land, it appears you are fond of extravagant tales. Very like a whale, your cachalot. I hope you do not believe it." "Monsieur," replied the Canadian seriously, "we must believe anything about whales. Look how that fellow is going along. People say that these animals can go round the world in 15 days. I do not assert the contrary. But you are doubtless aware, Monsieur Aronnax, that the creation whales swam even more rapidly?" "Indeed, Ned. Why was that?" "Because they then had their tails like fishes, vertically placed, so that they struck the water from left to right, and from right to left. But the Creator, perceiving that they moved too quickly, altered the tail so that it now beats the water upwards and downwards to the detriment of great speed." "Good, Ned," I replied, but borrowing his own expression, I added, "Must we believe that?" "Not unless you like," said he, "and not any more than if I told you that there exist whales 300 feet long and 100,000 pounds weight." "Well, that is something," I said. "Nevertheless, it must be admitted that some cetaceans reach an enormous size, since they furnish, it is said, nearly 120 tons of oil." "I have seen as much," said the Canadian. "I willingly believe it, Ned, as I believe that some whales equal 100 elephants in size. Judge of the effect which would be produced by such a mass coming in contact with the vessel." "Is it true that vessels are wrecked by them?" asked Conseil. "No," I replied. "I do not believe ships are, but a tale is told that in the year 1820, in these very seas, a whale launched itself against the Essex and rammed her backwards at the rate of 4 yards in a second. The waves entered over the stern, and the vessel sank almost immediately." Ned looked at me quizzically. "I have received a blow from the tail of a whale," he said. "In my boat, of course. My companions and I were flung 6 or 7 yards into the air. But besides your animals, sir, mine was but a baby." "Do these animals live long?" asked Conseil. 1,000 years, replied Ned. "How do you know that, Ned?" "Because I have been told so." "And why did they tell you so?" "Because they knew it." "No, Ned," I said. "They do not know it. They only supposed so. 400 years ago, when whale fishing first began, these animals were larger than they are at present. Therefore, people suppose that the smaller size is due to the fact that they have not had time to grow to their full bulk. That caused Buffon to state that whales lived 1,000 years. Do you see?" Ned Land neither heard nor understood. The whale was approaching, and he was devouring him with all his eyes. "Ah," he exclaimed, "it is not one whale, there is a whole school, and I am unable to do anything, tied here hand and foot." "But, friend Ned," said Conseil, "why do you not ask permission to hunt them?" Scarcely were the words uttered than Ned Land had descended in search of the captain, In a few moments they appeared together. Captain Nemo looked at the whales which were spouting about a mile away. "They are southern whales," he said, "and would make the fortune of a whaling fleet." "Well then, monsieur, may we not chase them, if it be for nothing else than to keep my hand in?" "For what object?" replied the captain. "Simply for the sake of killing. We have no use for oil on board." "Nevertheless, in the Red Sea you permitted us to kill the dugong." "It was then with a view to procure fresh meat for my crew. Here it is only killing for killing's sake. I know very well it is man's privilege, but I do not like killing for pastime. In destroying the southern whales, like the Greenland whale, inoffensive and useful animals, people like you, Master Land, are very culpable. They have already decimated them in Baffin's Bay, and a class of useful animals is being annihilated. Leave these poor cetaceans alone. They have plenty of natural enemies, cachalots, swordfish and sawfish, without you." I leave you to imagine what a figure the Canadian cut during this homily. To talk like that to a hunter was to throw words away. Ned gazed at the captain, and evidently did not understand him. Nevertheless, the captain was right. The barbarous and indiscriminate fishing will soon clear off all the whales from the ocean. Ned whistled Yankee Doodle, thrust his hands into his pockets, and turned his back on us. Captain Nemo continued to watch the cetaceans, and turning to me said, "I was right in saying that, without counting man, whales had enemies enough. Those will have enough to occupy them soon. Do you see those black moving spots about 8 miles to leeward, Monsieur Aronnax?" "Yes," I replied, "those are cachalots. Terrible animals, too. I have sometimes met them in schools of 200 or 300 at a time. They are cruel creatures, and one will do well to kill them." The Canadian turned quickly. "Well, Captain, there is still time, even in the interest of the whales." "It is no use to expose oneself. The Nautilus will suffice to disperse them. It is armed with a steel spur as good as Ned Land's harpoon, I imagine." The Canadian did not even trouble to shrug his shoulders. Who had ever heard of attacking cetaceans with a spur? "Wait, Monsieur Aronnax," said the captain, "and you will see a novel chase. We need not pity these ferocious beasts. They are only mouth and teeth." All mouth and teeth. No better description of the macrocephalous cachalot could have been given. It is sometimes 75 feet in length. Its enormous head is fully 1/3 of its body. It is better armed than the whale, whose upper jaw is only furnished with whalebone, while the cachalot has 25 large teeth about 8 inches long, round and pointed at the top, weighing about 2 pounds each. In the upper part of the enormous head, the valuable spermaceti is found in large quantities. The cachalot is a very disagreeable animal, more tadpole than fish, according to Fredol. It is very badly made, so to speak, and one side is quite a failure, for it can only see with the right eye. Meanwhile, this school of monsters was approaching. They had perceived the whales and hastened to attack them. One could predict victory for the cachalots, not only because they were better fitted for the encounter than their defenceless adversaries, but also because they could remain longer beneath the waves without rising to breathe. There was scarcely time to go to the assistance of the whales. The Nautilus went underwater. Conseil, Ned, and I took our places at the windows of the saloon. Captain Nemo stood by the helmsman so as to work the vessel like an engine of destruction. I soon heard the beating of the screw, and our speed increased. The fight had already commenced when the Nautilus arrived on the scene. We steered so as to divide the cachalots. They at first appeared little impressed at the sight of the new monster which had come to take part in the battle, but very soon they had to guard its attack. What a struggle it was! Ned Land, very quickly excited, clapped his hands. The Nautilus was like a tremendous harpoon brandished in the captain's hand. He turned it against the thick, fleshy masses, cutting them asunder, leaving the quivering portions of the animal in the wake. We did not feel the furious blows applied to the side of the Nautilus, nor the shocks they produced to any great extent. One cachalot slain, we rushed at another, backing, going ahead or astern, underwater or remounting to the surface, and then striking in full or diagonally, cutting or tearing in every direction, at all paces piercing them with the terrible spear. It was a massacre. The noise was prodigious. The hissing and snorting of the enraged animals was deafening. In these usually calm waters there were enormous waves. For an hour this Homeric massacre continued. The cachalots could not get away. Frequently 10 or a dozen would get together and attempt to crush the Nautilus beneath their weight. We could see from the window their enormous throats lined with teeth and their formidable eyes. Ned Land threatened and cursed them alternately. We could feel them fasten upon the hull and worry it like wild dogs their prey. But the Nautilus, putting on the steam, would carry them along either up or down without heeding their enormous bulk or their tremendous pull on the vessel. At length the cachalots fled. The sea became calm again. We ascended to the surface, the panels were opened, we hastened to the platform. The ocean was covered with mutilated bodies. A tremendous explosion could not have had more terrible effects. We were floating, surrounded by gigantic corpses. Some cachalots were visible on the horizon in full retreat. The waves were tinged with red for several miles, and we appeared to be sailing in a sea of blood. Captain Nemo now joined us. "Well, Master Land," he said. "Well, sir," replied the Canadian, whose ardour had somewhat abated. "It is really a terrible spectacle, but I am not a butcher myself. I am merely a hunter, and this has been butchery." "It was only a massacre of mischievous animals," replied the captain, "and the Nautilus is not a butcher's knife." "I prefer my harpoon," replied Ned. "Everyone to his own weapon," replied the captain, looking steadily at the Canadian. I was afraid the latter would give way to some violence, which would have deplorable consequences. But his wrath was turned aside by the sight of a whale, which the Nautilus had just reached. The animal had not escaped scot-free from the jaws of the cachalots. I recognized the southern whale by its black and flattened head. Anatomically, it is distinguished from the white and the North Cape whales by the joining of the 7 cervical vertebrae, and it possesses 2 more ribs than the others. This unhappy specimen was lying upon its side, the belly bit into pieces, quite dead. From a mutilated fin still hung a young whale, which the poor animal could not save from the massacre. The water flowed in and out of its open mouth with a sound like waves breaking on the shore. Captain Nemo guided the Nautilus close to the body. 2 men then mounted it, and with little to no astonishment I saw them draw all the milk from the breasts, about 2 or 3 tons. The captain offered me a glass of the still warm liquid. I could not conceal my repugnance, but he assured me it was excellent, and could not be in any way distinguished from cow's milk. I tasted it, and found he was right. This, therefore, gave us a very useful supply, for cheese and butter would improve our table. From that day I noticed that Ned Land grew more and more badly disposed towards the captain, and I resolved to keep a strict watch on the sayings and doings of the Canadian. Chapter 13. The Icebergs. The Nautilus still continued her southerly course. Was it Captain Nemo's wish to reach the pole? I did think so, for hitherto all such attempts had signally failed. Besides, the season was too far advanced, as the 13th of March in those latitudes corresponds to the 13th of September in northern climates, when the equinoctial period commences. Upon the 14th of March, I perceived ice floating in latitude 55 degrees, merely field ice in patches 20 to 25 feet long, upon which the waves broke. The Nautilus remained at the surface, Ned Land, having fished in Arctic seas, was familiar with icebergs. Conseil and I admired them for the first time. Towards the southern horizon, in the air, lay extended a white band of dazzling appearance. This is what English whalers have called the ice blink. No matter how thick the clouds, they cannot obscure its rays. It betokens the near approach to a pack or floe of ice. And, sure enough, blocks of considerable size soon began to make their appearance, whose brilliancy was modified by the caprice of the fogs. Upon some of these masses we could trace green veins, as if caused by sulphate of copper. Others appeared like immense amethysts, through which the light penetrated. Some reflected the rays from the 1,000 facets of their crystals, while others, clouded with vivid calcareous reflections, would have passed for a town of marble. The further we got southward, the greater became the size and frequency of the icebergs. Polar birds built in them by thousands, petrels, damiers and puffins deafened us with their screams. Some of these birds, taking the Nautilus for the dead body of a whale, came to rest upon it and pecked the iron skin. During our progress through the ice, Captain Nemo kept upon deck. He took note of these desolate places. I perceived his calm face light up now and then. Was he thinking how much at home he was in these polar seas, denied to other men? Perhaps so, but he did not speak. He piloted the Nautilus with consummate skill, avoiding skillfully any encounter with those masses, some of which were many miles long, and of a height varying from 200 to 250 feet. The horizon often appeared entirely shut in. At the 60 degrees of latitude, all passage seemed barred, but the captain, after a careful search, found a narrow opening through which he glided boldly, knowing very well, however, that it would close in on his wake. Thus the Nautilus, skillfully steered past all this ice, classed with a precision that delighted Conseil, according to their form or size, icebergs or mountains, ice fields or united and apparently boundless expanses, drift ice or packs, when circular called palks, or streams when they are lengthened out. The temperature was very low. The thermometer marked 2 degrees to 3 degrees below zero in the open air, but we were warmly clad in furs at the cost of the seal and sea bear. The interior of the Nautilus, warmed by the electric apparatus, defied the most intense cold. Besides, we had only to go under water a few yards to find a comfortable temperature. 2 months earlier, we should have enjoyed perpetual day in these latitudes, but now we had 3 or 4 hours night, and later 6 months darkness would envelop these circumpolar regions. On the 15th of March we passed the latitude of the islands of New Zealand and the South Orkneys. The captain informed me that at one time quantities of seals inhabited those islands, but the English and American whalers, in their zeal for killing, massacred males and females indiscriminately, and, where once life had been, after their departure was the silence of death. On the 16th of March, about 8 a.m., the Nautilus crossed the Antarctic Circle. Ice lay all round us and closed in upon the horizon. Nevertheless, the captain still kept on towards the pole. "But where can he be going?" I said to Conseil. "Ahead," he replied, "and when he cannot get any farther, he will stop." "I wouldn't swear to that," I said. And to tell the truth, I was not displeased at this adventurous kind of life. I cannot express the degree of pleasure I experienced in these novel regions. The ice assumed the most impressive and beautiful forms. Here was an oriental town with innumerable mosques and minarets. There a city thrown headlong to the ground by some natural convulsion. These appearances were continually varied by the oblique rays of the sun, or lost amid the grey mists of hurricanes of snow. On all sides were the detonations and the sound of the falls of great masses of ice, which changed the aspect at once, like the passing scene of a diorama. Whenever these falls took place, while the Nautilus was under water, the noise was astounding to our ears, and the waves were moved even to the lowest depths. At these times the Nautilus rolled and pitched like an abandoned vessel at sea. On several occasions, as I could not discover any exit, I thought we were actually hemmed in by the ice, but, as if it were by instinct, Captain Nemo could always hit upon a passage. He was never mistaken when he could see the little blue rivulets trickling through the field ice. I had now no doubt that he had already ventured into these Antarctic seas. However, on the 16th of March the ice stopped us completely. Not icebergs, but vast ice fields. This could not stop the captain, however, and he rushed into the ice with tremendous speed. The Nautilus penetrated like a wedge into this brittle mass, dividing it with loud cracking. It was like the old battering ram impelled with tremendous power. The fragments of ice thrown high in the air fell round us like hail. By its own impulsive force, the Nautilus made a channel through it. Sometimes carried forward by its impetus, it rose over the ice and crushed it beneath its weight. Sometimes, when beneath the ice field, it broke it up by a simple pitching movement. All this time we encountered violent squalls and thick fogs prevented us from seeing one end of the platform to the other. The wind blew sharply from all round the compass, and the snow lay so thickly that we had to break it up with the pickaxes. This temperature was steady at 5 degrees below zero, and the Nautilus was completely covered with ice. An ordinary vessel could not have worked her way through, as the rigging would have been frozen in the blocks and pulleys. Such a ship as ours had the only chance of success. Under these circumstances, the barometer kept very low. It fell even up to 73 degrees 5 minutes. The compass gave us no guarantee. The erring needles marked contrary directions as we approached the south meridional pole, which must not be confused with the south pole of the Earth. According to Houston, this pole is situated close to 70 degrees latitude and 130 degrees longitude, and according to the observations of Duperrey, in 135 degrees longitude and 70 degrees 30 minutes latitude. We were, therefore, obliged to make numerous observations and move the compasses from place to place in the ship to get a meridian. But frequently they trusted to the reckoning to make out the course we had run, a very unsatisfactory method in the midst of these winding passes, in which the landmarks were constantly changing. At length, the Nautilus was actually blocked on the 18th of March. There were no longer streams, packs, nor fields, but an immovable, interminable barrier formed by mountains of ice wedged together. "An iceberg," said Ned Land to me. I knew that to Ned Land, like all other navigators, this was insurmountable. The sun appeared at noon for an instant, and Captain Nemo had obtained an observation which gave our position as 51 degrees 30 minutes longitude and 67 degrees 39 minutes south latitude. We were now a point more advanced in the Antarctic regions. We were unable to obtain even a glimpse of sea. Before the Nautilus lay a vast, confused plain, heaped with ice blocks, with all the capricious pell-mell confusion which characterizes the surface of a river before the ice thaws on it, but on an immense scale. Here and there, sharp peaks and delicate needle points raised themselves to a height of 200 feet. Farther on was a long line of cliffs hewn out into great peaks and of greyish tint, vast mirrors which reflected the half-obscured sunbeams. The dread silence was scarcely disturbed by the flapping of the seabirds' wings. Everything, even the noise, seemed frozen up. The Nautilus was obliged to halt in her adventurous course in the midst of the ice field. "Monsieur," said Ned Land to me one day, "if this captain of yours goes any further, well, he will be something very wonderful." "Why, Ned?" "Because no one ever crossed an iceberg. Captain Nemo is powerful, but confound him, he is not stronger than nature, and where she has placed bounds, he must stop willy-nilly." "Just so, Ned, and I should like to know what is behind this iceberg." "A wall. That is what irritates me more." "Monsieur is quite right," said Conseil. "Walls are only invented to irritate savants. There never ought to be any walls." "Well," said the Canadian, "they know very well what is behind this iceberg." "What?" "Ice. Nothing but ice." "You appear certain about that, Ned," I replied, "but I'm not at all sure, and that is why I want to see." "Then, sir, you may relinquish the idea. You have reached the iceberg, which is quite enough, and neither you nor Captain Nemo nor his Nautilus will go any farther. And, whether he will or no, we must go northwards again, that is to say, amongst honest people." Notwithstanding all our efforts, notwithstanding the most powerful means employed to break up the ice, the Nautilus remained motionless. Usually, in like cases, when progress is impossible, the return path is open, but in this case to return was as impracticable as to advance, for all passages were closed astern, and if our vessel remained stationary for a little, it would be at once blocked up. This actually happened about 2:00 p.m., and the young ice formed round us with surprising rapidity. I was obliged to confess that Captain Nemo had been more than imprudent. I was on the platform at the time. The captain, who had been taking in this situation for some time, said to me, "Well, Professor, what do you think of this?" "I think we are prisoners, Captain." "Prisoners? How do you make that out?" "I mean, as we can neither move forwards or backwards, nor to either side. That is being a prisoner. At least, in civilized countries it is so considered." "So, Monsieur Aronnax, you think that the Nautilus cannot get away?" "It will be very difficult, at least for the season is already too far advanced to give you any hope of a temporary break-up of the ice." "Ah, Monsieur Aronnax," replied the captain in an ironical tone of voice, "you will always be the same. You see nothing but obstacles and difficulties in the way. Now, I not only assert that the Nautilus will disengage herself, but that she will go farther on." "Further south?" I asked, gazing at the captain. "Yes, she will go to the pole." "To the pole?" I exclaimed incredulously. "Yes," the captain replied coldly, "to the Antarctic pole, to that unknown point from which every meridian of the earth springs. You are aware that I can do as I please with the Nautilus." "Yes, I did know that, but this man was bold to recklessness. But to overcome the obstacles surrounding the South Pole, more inaccessible than the North Pole, which had not yet been discovered by the most hardy explorers, was to carry out a mad idea, and one which only the mind of a madman could conceive." It then occurred to me to ask Captain Nemo whether he had already discovered the pole, which had never yet been touched by human foot. "No, Professor," he replied, "we will discover it together. Where other people have failed, I shall not fail. I have never hitherto driven my Nautilus so far over the southern seas, but I repeat, we shall go farther still." "I wish to believe you, Captain," I replied with a playful irony. "I do believe you. Let us get on. There is nothing to hinder us. Let us smash up this iceberg, blow it to pieces if it resist. Let us give the Nautilus her wings to fly over it." "Over it, Professor?" said the captain calmly. "Not over it. Under it." "Under it?" I exclaimed. A sudden revelation of the captain's plans flashed into my mind. I understood it all. The wonderful qualities of the Nautilus were, once again, to serve in a superhuman enterprise. "I perceive we are beginning to understand each other, Professor," said the captain, smiling. "You already see the possibility, nay, the success of our attempt." What, to an ordinary vessel, is impracticable, to the Nautilus is easy of accomplishment. If a continent is around the pole, we must stop at the continent, but if, on the contrary, the open sea laves it, we shall run up to the pole itself. In fact, I said, quite carried away by the captain's reasoning, if the surface of the sea be solidified by ice, the lower depths are free, in consequence of the natural law that has fixed the maximum density of salt water at 1 degree higher than freezing point, and if I am right, the submerged portion of this iceberg is to the very part out of the water as 4 to 1. Very nearly, Professor, for 1 foot of iceberg above the water there are, as a rule, 3 below. Now, since these icy mountains are never more than 300 feet high, they are not more than 900 feet below, and what is a depth of 900 feet to the Nautilus? Nothing at all. We could even seek, at a greater depth, the equable temperature of seawater, and disdain the 30 degrees or 40 degrees of surface cold. Quite so, I assented. The only difficulty for us, said Captain Nemo, would be to remain many days under water without renewing our supply of fresh air. "Oh, is that all?" I cried. "Why, the Nautilus has immense reservoirs, and they can supply us with all the oxygen we shall require." "Happy thought, Monsieur Aronnax," replied the captain, smiling. "But as I do not want you to think me reckless, I will submit to you my objections in advance." "Have you any more?" "Only one. It is possible that if there be sea around the South Pole, it may be frozen, and in that case we should not be able to return to the surface at all." "Very well, but you forget that the Nautilus is armed with a sharp spur, and cannot we cut our way diagonally through the ice, which would give way before us?" "Certainly, Professor, you are brilliant today." "Besides, Captain," I added enthusiastically, "why may we not find the sea free at the South Pole as well as at the North? The ice poles and the Earth's poles are not the same in either hemisphere, and until there is proof adduced to the contrary, we may fairly assume that there is a continent or an ocean free from ice at these extremities of the globe." "I agree with you, Monsieur Aronnax," replied the captain. "I would hint to you, however, that after first making all kinds of objections to my plan, you are now overwhelming me with arguments in favour of it." Captain Nemo only spoke the truth. I had been out-Heroding Herod. It was I who was taking him to the pole. I was going ahead of him altogether. But no, poor fool. Captain Nemo knows better than you the pros and cons of this question, and it only amused him to see you carried away by visions of the impossible. All the same, he had not lost a minute. At a signal, the mate appeared. These two then conversed rapidly in their incomprehensible language, and whether the mate had been previously warned or whether he believed the project practicable, he, at any rate, showed no surprise. But impassible as he was, he did not come up to Conseil in that respect, for when I announced to him our intention to reach the South Pole, he merely said, "Just as Monsieur pleases," and I had to be content with that. For as Ned Land, if ever shoulders were lifted, they were those of the Canadian. "Look here, sir," said Ned Land, "I pity you and your captain." "But we are going to the pole, Master Ned." "Well, you may go there, but you will never come back again." And Ned Land went to his cabin, so as not to make a disturbance, he said as he left me. Meanwhile, the preparations for this rash expedition were commenced. The powerful pumps filled the reservoirs with air and stowed it at a high pressure. About 4 o'clock, Captain Nemo informed me that the panels on the platform were about to be closed. I took a last look at the thick iceberg which we were about to penetrate. The weather was fine, the atmosphere clear, the cold piercing, 12 degrees below zero, but there was no wind. As there was no wind, this cold was bearable. A dozen men, armed with axes, cut away the ice around the Nautilus. This was soon done, and the young ice was still thin. We all descended into the interior. The usual reservoirs were filled with water, and the Nautilus quickly sank. I sat with Conseil in the saloon. Through the open window we could inspect the lower beds of the Southern Ocean. The thermometer rose. The needle of the manometer deviated on the dial plate. At about 300 yards down, as the captain had anticipated, we were floating below the moving icebergs, but the Nautilus went lower still. It reached 800 yards depth. The temperature of the water was 12 degrees at the surface. Down here it was only 10. 2 degrees had been already gained. Of course, the temperature of the Nautilus was maintained at a higher level by 1 degree by its heating apparatus. All its movements were executed with wondrous precision. "If Monsieur please, I think we shall get through," said Conseil. "I quite expect so," I replied in a tone of conviction. In this open water, the Nautilus steered direct for the pole without quitting the 52nd meridian. From 67 degrees 30 minutes to 90 degrees 23 and a half degrees of latitude remained to be got over, or a little more than 500 leagues. The average speed was 28 miles an hour. At this rate, we should reach the pole in 40 hours. For a portion of the night, the novelty of the situation kept us at the window of the saloon. The sea was lit up by the electric lamp, but it was deserted. Fish could not live in those prison waters. They would only find a passage here from the Antarctic Ocean to the open polar sea. Our progress was rapid, as we could feel by the quivering of the hull. About 2:00 a.m. I retired to snatch some sleep, and Conseil did likewise. On my way, I did not meet Captain Nemo. I suppose he was in the pilot house. Next morning, 19th of March, I again took my place at the window. The speed of the Nautilus had been diminished. We were ascending, prudently emptying the reservoirs, but slowly. My heart beat fast. Were we about to emerge and breathe fresh air around the pole? No. A shock told me that the Nautilus had struck the underside of an iceberg, still very thick, judging from the sound. We had touched bottom, to use a sea term, but in the inverse sense, and at 1,000 feet below. This would give us 2,000 feet of ice above us, of which 1,000 feet were above sea level. So the iceberg must be thicker now than when we started, which was not a very cheerful conclusion to arrive at. Many times during the day the Nautilus tried the ice, and always with the same success. At certain times it encountered this icy ceiling at a depth of 900 yards, which gave a thickness of 1,000 yards in all, 200 being above the sea level. The ice was double the thickness at the surface now, the ice was double the thickness at the surface now than when it had been when we first plunged beneath it. I noted these different depths carefully, and thus obtained a submarine profile of this chain of mountains as it were developed underwater. By the evening, no change had taken place. Ice everywhere, between 400 and 500 yards deep. The thickness was diminishing, but what a depth yet remained between us and the surface of the ocean. It was 8 o'clock. At 4 o'clock the air of the Nautilus should have been renewed as usual. However, I did not suffer much, though no demand had been made on the reservoirs for a supply of oxygen. I slept but little that night. Hope and fear assailed me by turns. I got up many times. The Nautilus continued to tap the ice. Towards 3 a.m. I noticed that the lower surface of the iceberg was only 50 yards down. Only 150 feet now separated us from the surface. The iceberg was rapidly becoming an ice field. The mountain was dropping to a plain. My eyes never left the manometer. We kept ascending steadily and diagonally. The surrounding surface glittered beneath our electric light. The ice was getting thinner above and below, mile after mile. At length, at 6 o'clock a.m., on this memorable 19th of March, Captain Nemo opened the door of the saloon and said, "We are in open water." And that takes us to the end of the chapter, and where I shall take a break, because, yeah, that was a longer block, and the next one will also be longer. So, I'm going to go for 5 minutes. Speedy, welcome in. You are welcome to lurk, encouraged to do so. And, yeah, Uzora and Kira Falconia, if I'm saying that right. Hello, welcome. I hope everyone's well. But yeah, I'm going to go take a break, stretch my lungs and that, and we'll see you back here in around about 5 minutes. See you in a bit. Well, hello, and welcome back. I trust that you have used your break time responsibly, as I have done, to quickly run downstairs and make a cup of tea. This is a mint chocolate one, which I've been enjoying a lot, so I'm just gonna... Didn't let the last call play. Well, I can't hear it. I don't have headphones on or anything. I'm not monitoring the sound, so... You know, you just get to live with that disappointment. Mint chocolate tea, yeah. Oh, Kitaka, hey, what's up? Welcome. How you doing? Yes, it's mint chocolate tea. It's from a place that... I'll talk for a little bit, why not? Give it time to stew. A place that Lucy showed me here in the UK. It's called, I think, is it T2 Teas? Like... letter T, number 2, and she got me some Smoky Russian Caravan from there, which is also really good. And then I went silly and wanted a bunch more tea, so I went and browsed their stock for other ones, to try some stuff that like doesn't have like caffeine or black tea in it and that. And this is, yeah, it's a mint chocolate one. It's like rooibos and peppermint and like cacao in there or something, and it's really nice. Usually it's the sort of thing that I would expect to be disappointed by, because I've had a lot of like fruit teas and other kind of flavoured teas which end up just being like scented teas. I can remember as a kid having that sort of apple tea, expecting it to be really nice, and it sure smelt like apples and it tasted like hot water. So yeah, I kind of expected bad times with this, but honestly it's surprisingly nice. It's got good peppermint, and it's also got a decent chocolate flavour in there, and it doesn't just feel like I'm drinking hot water. So, you know, it works. Keto Cat, you're right, waiting on laundry, finally looking for media while reading is happening. Nice. I hope I need to do some laundry. I always need to do laundry. It's just I'm only ever happy when I've just done it, and then it just starts accumulating again, and it sucks. But yeah, well, yeah, welcome. Glad to have you here. Nice to see you showing up. I hope that you don't mind that we are getting towards the end of 20,000 Leagues. Spoilers. There's water. There's some people on a submarine. They go places. Again, my apparent long misunderstanding of the story had been that implausibly the 20,000 leagues mentioned were a depth, not distance. And through reading it, I have learned that no, in fact, it references the distance travelled by sea, not let's just go down to the bottom of the sea and then keep going for an improbable distance. Jules Verne loves facts. Yeah, Jules Verne padded this novel with Wikipedia entries, like he's trying to hit a word count. But yeah, I guess I shouldn't dunk on it too much more until the end of the stream, because we're still kind of in reading time. But yeah, welcome. I shall carry on. We have still a lot more to go before the end, because as I was saying before, I was trying to like split, excuse me, that TASMR, I'm trying to split this into 2 streams worth rather than stretch it over 3, and that means 2 slightly longer chunks of reading, which is what we're doing now. But yeah, lurk away, whatever makes you happy or comfortable. I'm barely glancing at chat. I'm certainly not interacting whilst reading, so yeah, there's no pressure to try and get my attention while doing any of this. In fact, I should probably not be paying any attention to chat, because, you know, then I'm going to get lost. But anyway, enough talking. I shall resume with Chapter 14, The South Pole. I hurried to the platform. Yes, the sea was clear of ice, with the exception of a few scattered pieces of moving icebergs. In the distance, a long extent of open sea. Birds filled the air. Fish crowded the sea, which, according to its depth, varied from an intense blue to an olive green. The thermometer marked 3 degrees centigrade below zero. This was, comparatively speaking, spring, shut up behind the icebergs whose distant masses were visible on the northern pole. "Are we at the pole?" I asked, with a beating heart. "I do not know," he said. "I will take the bearings at noon." "But shall we be able to see the sun through the fog?" I asked, looking at the dull grey sky. "If he shine out ever so little, it will suffice," said the captain. 10 miles to the southward, a solitary islet rose to the height of 200 yards. We advanced towards it, cautiously, for it might have been surrounded by shoals. An hour later we had reached it. 2 hours after that we had explored it. It was between 4 and 5 miles in circumference. A narrow canal separated it from a large tract of land of which I could not see the whole extent. The existence of this land appeared to confirm Maury's theory. That ingenious American had stated that between the South Pole and the 60th parallel the sea is covered with floating ice of great size, which is never met with in the North Atlantic. From this fact he has deduced the conclusion that the Antarctic Circle encloses large tracts of land, since the icebergs cannot form in the open sea, but only on a coast. According to his calculations, the mass of ice surrounding the South Pole forms an enormous cap, extending about 2,400 miles. Meanwhile, the Nautilus, for fear of striking, stopped at 3 cables' length from a beach crowned by a splendid mass of rock. The boat was launched. The captain, 2 men carrying the instruments, Conseil and I embarked. It was 10 o'clock. I had not seen Ned land. He probably did not wish to stultify himself in the presence of the South Pole. A few strokes brought us to land. Conseil was about to jump ashore, but I restrained him. "Sir," I said to Captain Nemo, "to you belongs the honour of first landing on this ground." "Yes," replied the captain, "and if I do not hesitate to tread this polar soil, it is because no man has ever landed here before." As he ceased speaking, he leapt lightly ashore. His heart was beating with strong emotion. He climbed a rock which terminated in a little promontory, and there, with folded arms, with eager look, motionless and silent, he seemed to take possession of those southern regions. After 5 minutes he returned to us. "Hi, Joey." "Now, Professor, when you please," he cried. I then disembarked, followed by Conseil, leaving the 2 sailors in the boat. For some distance the soil appeared to be composed of tufa, a reddish colour, something like powdered bricks. Scoriae, lava streams and pumice stone covered it. We could not mistake its volcanic origin. In some places arose a light smoke, which emitted a smell of sulphur, thereby attesting that the subterranean fires had lost none of their expansive power. However, having ascended a high pinnacle of rock, I could perceive no volcano. We know that in these regions James Ross discovered the craters of Erebus and Terror in full activity in the 167th meridian, in latitude 77 degrees 32 minutes south. Yes, Joey's staring at me. He wants to come up on my lap. Look, you can jump up, buddy. Come on. The vegetation appeared very limited. Some lichens of the Usnea melanoxantha kind spread over the black rocks. Some microscopic plants, rudimentary diatomas, a kind of cells placed between 2 quartz shells, with long purple and scarlet fucus supported by their little swimming bladders, which the surf carried to the shore, composed all the meagre flora of this region. The beach was covered with mollusks, small mussels, limpets, smooth, heart-shaped buckards, and particularly Cleos with oblong and membranous bodies, whose heads are formed of 2 rounded lobes. There were myriads of northern Cleos about an inch long, of which a whale would swallow a world at one gulp. These charming pteropods, perfect sea butterflies, gave animation to the shore. Amongst other zoophytes appeared, in the higher levels, some arborescent corals, of the species of which, according to James Ross, live in the Antarctic seas at 1,000 feet deep. Then there were little alcures, belonging to the species Procellaria pelagica, and also a number of asteroids peculiar to these climates, and starfish. But it was in the air that life was so prolific. Thousands of birds flew and wheeled around us, deafening us with their cries. Others crowded upon the rocks and watched us pass without fear, and even came close to our feet. There were penguins, so agile in the water that they had been mistaken for the active bonitos, and yet so very heavy and clumsy on shore. They uttered harsh cries and formed a numerous assemblage, quiet in their movements but wonderful as to the clamour. Amongst the birds I recognised the Orkneys of a family of waders. It is as large as a pigeon, white, with a short and pointed beak with a red circle round the eye. Conseil laid in a stock of these, for, properly prepared, these birds are very good to eat. Albatrosses flew about the width of their expanded wings being fully 12 feet. They are rightly called the ocean vultures. Gigantic petrels, amongst others the quebrantuesas, with curved wings. These birds are great eaters of seals. Some damiers Joey's just settling on my lap. Some damiers, a kind of small duck, the upper part of whose bodies is black and white, a quantity of petrels, some white with brown bordered wings, some blue, peculiar to the Antarctic seas, and so full of oil. I told Conseil that the inhabitants of the Faroe Islands have only to insert a wick in their bodies before lighting them. A very little more and they would be perfect lamps, replied Conseil, so we can scarcely expect nature to have furnished them with wicks at first. After half a mile the ground was riddled with ruff's nests. It was a laying ground, and from which many birds were escaping. Captain Nemo caused some hundreds to be hunted down, for their flesh is tasty. They uttered a cry something similar to the bray of an ass. They are about as large as a goose, body of a slaty colour, white underneath, and with a yellow ring around the neck. They were killed with stones without making any attempts to escape. All this time the fog hung over us, and at 11 a.m. the sun had not shone out. His absence caused me some uneasiness, for without his appearance we could get no observations. How then could we ascertain whether we had reached the pole? When I rejoined Captain Nemo, I found him leaning against a rock, gazing at the sky. He seemed impatient, worried. But what was to be done? He could not command the sun like the sea. Midday arrived, and the sun had not appeared for a moment. We could not even see its position through the fog, and the fog soon turned to snow. "Tomorrow," the captain said calmly, and we returned to the Nautilus. During our absence the nets had been drawn, and I noticed with much interest the fish that had been captured, which were chiefly migrates from less elevated zones. I tasted some of them subsequently and found them insipid, notwithstanding Conseil's own opinion, for he liked them. The snowstorm continued till next day. It was impossible to remain on the platform. Even in the saloon, where I stayed to make notes of the excursion, I could hear the cries of the petrels and albatrosses sporting in the storm. The Nautilus did not remain at anchor, but went down the coast about 10 miles to the south in the midst of the twilight left by the sun as it touched the horizon. Next day, 20th of March, the snow had ceased to fall. The cold was rather more intense. The thermometer was 2 degrees below zero. The mists were lifting, and I was in hopes that today we should be able to take the observation. Captain Nemo not having yet appeared, the boat took Conseil and myself ashore. The soil was of the same nature, volcanic. All around were traces of lava, scoriae and basalt, although I could see no crater. Here, as lower down, the myriads of birds enlivened the scene, but their dominion was here divided with troops of marine mammifers, which gazed at us from their soft eyes. There were various species of seals, some extended on the ground, others on the ice, many plunging in and emerging from the water. They did not move at our approach, and never having before encountered man. They did not move at our approach, never before having encountered man, and I calculated that there were sufficient to fill hundreds of ships. "Faith," said Conseil, "it is a very good thing that Ned Land did not come with us." "Why, Conseil?" "Because he would have killed all these." "All of them?" "That is saying a great deal, but I do not think we should have been able to prevent our Canadian friend from harpooning some of these splendid cetaceans. That would have annoyed Captain Nemo, for he does not spill the blood of inoffensive animals wantonly." "He is quite right." "Certainly, Conseil, but tell me, have you not already classed these magnificent specimens of marine fauna?" "Monsieur knows," replied Conseil, "that I am not well up in it. When Monsieur has told me the names of the animals—" "They are seals and morses," said I. "Two genus which belong to the family Pinnipeds," said Conseil, "order Carnivorous, group Unguiculus, subclass Monodelphians, class Mammifer, branch Vertebrates." "Good, Conseil," I replied. "But these two genus are divided into species, and, if I am not mistaken, we shall here have the opportunity to observe them. Let us go on." It was now 8 a.m. We had 4 hours before the sun could be observed with advantage. Therefore I advanced towards a large bay, which had hollowed itself out of the granite cliffs. There, as far as we could see, the earth and ice fragments were absolutely covered with marine mammifers, and I looked involuntarily for Proteus, the mythological shepherd who guarded Neptune's immense flocks. The seals were most numerous. They formed distinct groups, males and females, the fathers watching the family, the mother suckling the young, some of which were sufficiently strong to walk a little. When any of the animals wished to move, they went along by little jumps due to the contraction of the body, and they helped themselves along awkwardly enough by means of their fin, which, as in the lamantrine, their congener forms a perfect forearm. In the water, their element, the spine is mobile and they are admirably adapted for swimming, the skin being smooth and the feet webbed. When resting upon the ground, their attitudes are extremely graceful. So the ancients, observing their expressive faces, soft looks, which even a beautiful woman cannot surpass, the clear and limpid eyes, their charming positions, and the poetry of their manners, metamorphosed the males into tritons and the females into sirens. I called Conseil's attention to the great development of the brain lobes of these interesting animals. No mammal, except man, has such a development of cerebral material. Thus, seals are capable of receiving a certain amount of education. They are easily domesticated, and I agree with some naturalists that, if properly taught, they could be easily utilized as fishing dogs. The greater number of the seals were asleep on the rocks or on the sand. Amongst the seals proper, which have no external ears, in which they differ from the others whose ears are prominent, I observed several varieties of the Celerinkai, about 9 feet long, white with bulldog heads, armed with 10 teeth in each jaw, 4 incisors above and below, and 2 great canine teeth shaped like a fleur-de-lis. Amongst them, sea elephants moved about. They are a kind of seal, having short, flexible trunks, and the giants of the species measured 20 feet round, and more than 30 feet long. They did not move as we approached them. "Are these creatures dangerous?" asked Conseil. "Not if they are not molested," I replied. "When a seal is obliged to defend her young, her rage is terrific, and they frequently break the fishing boats to pieces." "And quite right too," replied Conseil. "I will not contradict you." 2 miles farther, we were stopped by a promontory, which sheltered the bay from the south winds. It fell perpendicularly to the sea, which foamed round the basin surf. Beyond it we heard loud bellowing. "Hello!" cried Conseil. "There is a concert of bulls." "No," said I, "it is a Morse concert." "Are they fighting?" "Either that or playing." "I should like to see them," said Conseil. "We must have a look at them." Conseil, "Certainly." We commenced our ascent of the black rocks, and got many a tumble over the slippery stones. More than once I rolled over, and to the detriment of my ribs. Conseil, more prudent or more steady, did not fall, and was ready to help me up, saying if Monsieur would take longer steps, he would keep his balance better. When we arrived at the upper ridge of the promontory, I perceived a vast white plain, quite covered with morses. They were frisking about, so what we had heard were bellowings of joy, not anger. The morses resemble seals in form and the arrangement of their members, but the canine and incisor teeth are wanting in the lower jaw, and the superior canines are two long tusks. These teeth are of ivory, harder than that of the elephant, and less likely to become yellow, and are much sought after. So, morses are an object for the hunter, and they will soon be exterminated, as the fishers kill indiscriminately, females and young, upwards of 4,000 every year. We passed close to these curious animals, and I was enabled to examine them at leisure. Their skins are thick and rugged, of a fawn colour tending to red. The hair is short and scanty. Some of them were 12 feet long. Quieter and less timid than their northern relatives, they did not post sentinels to warn them of approaching danger. Having examined this city of morses, I thought it time to retrace my steps. It was 11 o'clock, and if Captain Nemo could find a favourable moment for his observations, I wished to be present at the time. However, I had little hope of the sun showing that day. The clouds, heaped up above the horizon, hid him from our sight. It seemed as if the jealous orb did not wish to reveal to human beings this inaccessible portion of the globe. Nevertheless, I made up my mind to return. We followed a narrow track which ran along the top of the cliff. At 11:30 we reached the landing place. The canoe was drawn up and had landed the captain and his instruments. I saw him standing upon a block of basalt. His instruments were ready at hand. His gaze was fixed upon the northern horizon, near which the sun was then describing a long curve. I took my place beside him, and waited without speaking. 12 o'clock came, and, as on the previous day, no sun was visible. It was fatality. The observation could not be made. If it could not be accomplished tomorrow, we must entirely give up the idea of knowing our situation. We were now at the 20th of March. The morrow, the 21st, was the equinox, refraction not counted. The sun would then disappear behind the horizon for 6 months, and at his departure the long polar night sets in. Since the September equinox it had risen above the horizon, rising in elongated curves daily till the 21st of December. At that time, the summer solstice of northern latitudes, it began to descend, and on the 21st of March it would pour out its last rays. I made known my observations and fears to Captain Nemo. "You are right, Monsieur Aronnax," he replied. "If tomorrow I do not obtain the height of the sun, I cannot repeat my attempt here for 6 months. But also, precisely because the chances of my sailing have led me to these seas on the 21st of March, my object will be all the easier to attain if, at midday, the sun will only show himself." "Why, Captain?" "Because when the orb describes such lengthened curves, it is difficult to measure exactly its height above the horizon, and the instruments are not unlikely to return erroneous results." "But how do you intend to proceed?" "I shall only use my chronometer," replied the captain. "If tomorrow, 21st of March, at noon, the disk of the sun, taking account for refraction, is exactly divided by the northern horizon. I shall know we are at the South Pole." "Quite so," said I, "but nevertheless this conclusion is not mathematically correct, since the equinox does not necessarily commence at midday." "No doubt, but the difference will not be 100 yards, and we do not want anything more than we shall get. Till tomorrow, then." Captain Nemo returned on board. Conseil and I remained until nearly 5 o'clock, surveying and studying the shore. I did not pick up any curious thing except a penguin's egg of enormous size, for which a collector would have paid 1,000 francs. Its Isabelle colour, its lines, and the characters which ornamented it like so many hieroglyphics made it quite a curiosity. I put it into Conseil's hands, and this prudent and sure-footed lad, holding it like a precious bit of china, carried it in safety on board the Nautilus. I placed the specimen in one of the glass cases of the saloon, and after an excellent supper of seal's liver, I went to sleep, first invoking the favour of the sun like a Hindu. Next morning at 5 o'clock, I ascended to the platform and there found Captain Nemo. "The weather is clearing a little," he said. "I begin to hope. After breakfast we will land to select a post of observation." This point settled, I went to find Ned Land. I wished him to come with me, but he refused, and I perceived that his sullenness increased every day. After all, I did not regret his decision under the circumstances. There were a number of seals on shore, and it was needless to submit the harpooner to such temptation. After breakfast, we went ashore. The Nautilus had worked up the coast a few miles during the night. We were in the offing, quite a league from the shore, which was commanded by a high peak of about 1,500 feet high. The boat carried, besides myself and Captain Nemo, 2 men and the instruments, a chronometer, a field glass, and a barometer. During our row, I noticed a number of the 3 austral species of whale, the right whale of the English fishers, which has no dorsal fin, the humpback, or the Balaenopteron, with creased belly and large white fins, which, notwithstanding its name, do not form wings, and the finback, a brownish-yellow creature, the most lively of all cetaceans. This powerful animal can be heard at a great distance when he throws to a great height columns of air and vapour which resemble clouds of smoke. These mammals disported themselves in the quiet sea, and I saw that the basin of the South Pole now served as a place of refuge for these cetacea too closely pressed by fishermen. At 9 o'clock we landed. The sky was clearing, the clouds were flying to the south, and the fogs rose. Captain Nemo directed his steps to the peak, whence he wished to make his observation, no doubt. It was a rough ascent over the sharp lava blocks and pumice stones, amid an atmosphere saturated with sulphurous exhalations. The captain, for a man accustomed to walk on land, ascended the steep and difficult slopes with an activity and agility I could not emulate, and which a chamois hunter would have envied. We had 2 hours to wait at the summit. From thence we commanded an extensive prospect of sea, which toward the north was clearly defined against the horizon. At our feet lay snowfields of dazzling whiteness. Overhead was the pale blue sky. In the north the sun's disk, like a ball of fire already horned by the cutting of the horizon. Magnificent jets of water rose by hundreds from the bosom of the ocean, and in the distance the Nautilus lay like a sleeping whale. Behind us, to the south and east, extended an immense tract of land, a chaotic mingling of rock and ice without visible boundary. Captain Nemo, having reached the very top of the peak, carefully took the mean elevation of the barometer, for that he would have to take into account in his observation. At 11:45, the sun, seen only by refraction, showed itself like a disk of gold, and threw its last rays upon this desolate continent, and those seas which man had never yet entered. The captain, furnished with a reticulated glass which, by means of a mirror corrected refraction, began to observe the sun, which was sinking slowly below the horizon in a long diagonal. I held the chronometer. My heart beat loudly. If the disappearance of half the disk coincided with noon on the chronometer, we were at the pole itself. 12 o'clock! I cried. The South Pole, replied the captain in a grave tone, and handing me the glass I perceived the orb of day precisely bisected by the horizon. I looked at the last rays tipping the peak and watched the shadows creeping up by degrees. At that moment, Captain Nemo turned to me and said, "Professor, in the year 1600, the Dutchman Gertic, driven by currents and storms, reached 64 degrees of south latitude and discovered New Shetland. In 1773, on the 17th of January, the illustrious Cook, following the 38th meridian, reached 67 degrees 30 minutes, and in 1774, on the 109th meridian, he got to 71 degrees 15 south latitude. The Russian, Bellinghausen, in 1819 found himself on the 69th parallel, and in 1821 on the 66th parallel in 110 degrees west longitude. In 1820, the Englishman Brunsfield stopped at the 65th degree. The same year, Morel, an American whose narratives are dubious, mounted to the 42nd meridian, discovered the open sea in 70 degrees 40 minutes south latitude. In 1825, Powell, an Englishman, was not able to get beyond the 62nd degree. The same year, a simple seal fisher, Weddell, an Englishman, reached as far as 74 degrees 15 minutes on the 36th meridian. In 1829, Foster, his countryman, captain of the Chanticleer, took possession of the Antarctic continent in 63 degrees 26 minutes south latitude and 66 degrees 26 minutes longitude. In 1831, Biscoe, upon the 1st of February, discovered the land he called Enderby, in latitude 68 degrees 50 minutes. In 1832, on the 5th of February, Adelaide, in latitude 67 degrees, and on 21st of February, Graham's Land, in latitude 64 degrees 45 minutes. In 1838, the French explorer Dumont d'Urville, stopped by ice in latitude 62 degrees 57 minutes, found the territory Louis Philippe. 2 years later, in a new place to the south on the 24th of January, he claimed Adélie in 66 degrees 30 minutes, and 8 days later, in 64 degrees 40 minutes, the Clary coasts. In 1838, Wilkes, an Englishman, advanced as far as the 69th parallel on the 100th meridian. In 1839, Bellerny, an Englishman, also discovered Sabrina Land, on the edge of the polar circle. Finally, in 1842, James Ross, mounting Erebus and Terror on the 12th of January in 76 degrees 56 minutes latitude and 171 degrees 7 minutes east longitude, discovered Victoria Land. On the 23rd of the same month he reached the 74th parallel, the highest point attained to that time. On the 27th day he was in 76 degrees 8 minutes, on the 28th at 77 degrees 32 minutes, on the 2nd of February in 78 degrees 4 minutes, and in 1842 he reached the 71st degree, which he could not pass. So then I, Captain Nemo, on this 21st of March 1868 have reached the South Pole on the 90th degree, and I take possession of this part of the globe, equal to 1/6 of the known continents. In whose name, Captain? In my own, he replied. As he spoke, he unfurled a black flag embroidered with an N in gold. Then, turning to the sun, whose last rays were tinting the waves on the horizon, he exclaimed, "Adieu, O sun! Disappear, radiant orb! Sleep beneath this open sea, and leave a long night of 6 months' duration to extend its shadow over my new dominion." Let's take a break at the end of that chapter for some tea. Chapter 15. Accident or Incident? Next morning, at 6 o'clock, the preparations for our departure commenced. The last hours of twilight were buried in the night. The cold was intense. The stars shone with wonderful brilliancy, and in the zenith glittered the Southern Cross, the polar star of the Antarctic regions. The thermometer marked 12 degrees below zero, and when the wind got up it bit shrewdly. The ice blocks increased upon the ocean. Numerous black patches spread themselves over the surface and announced the formation of the young ice. Evidently the southern basin, frozen during the 6 months of winter, was absolutely inaccessible. What became of the whales during that period? Doubtless they went below the icebergs to seek more open seas. As for the seals and morses, accustomed to live in the most icy climates, they remained where they were. The instinct of these animals bids them to cut holes in the ice and keep them always open. They come to these holes to breathe, and when the birds, chased away by the cold, have migrated to the north, the mammals are the sole occupants of the polar continent. 1 second. Joey will return in part 2. Where was I? Yes. However, the reservoirs were filled, and the Nautilus slowly descended. At a depth of 1,000 feet, it stopped. The screw beat the water, and it went right away towards the north at a rate of 15 miles an hour. Towards evening, we floated beneath the immense icebergs. The saloon panels had been closed as a matter of prudence, for the Nautilus might strike some immersed block of ice, so I employed myself during the day putting my notes in order. My mind was fully occupied in recollections of the pole. We had reached the hitherto inaccessible point without fatigue or danger, as if our floating wagon had run along a line of a railway. And now our return had actually begun. Had Captain Nemo any more such wonders in store? What a series of submarine wonders had I witnessed during the 5 months I had been on board. We had sailed 14,000 leagues, and incidents of the most curious or terrible nature had given a charm to our journey. The chase in the Isle of Crespo, the threading of Torres Strait, the coral cemetery, the Ceylon fisheries, the Arabian Tunnel, the fires of Santorin, Vigo Bay, Atlantide, and the South Pole. During the night, all these reminiscences prevented my sleeping. At 3 a.m., I was disturbed by a violent shock. I sat up and listened, when I was roughly thrown into the middle of the room. The Nautilus, having struck, had rebounded violently. I groped my way to the saloon, which was lighted from the ceiling. The furniture was upset. Happily, the glass cases were firmly fixed and had not given way. The pictures on the starboard side, the vessel being no longer upright, were hanging close to the paper, while those opposite were a foot from the wall. The Nautilus was lying on the starboard side, motionless. I could hear a noise of footsteps and hurried voices, but Captain Nemo did not appear. Just as I was about to leave the saloon, Ned and Conseil entered it. "What is the matter?" I asked. "We came to ask monsieur," said Conseil. "Thousand devils! I know what it is very well," said the Canadian. "The Nautilus has struck, and judging from the heel she has, I do not think she will recover as easily as she did in the Torres Strait." "But at least," said I, "we shall go up to the surface." "We do not know," replied Conseil. "We can easily find out," I said. I consulted the manometer. To my great surprise, it indicated a depth of 11,000 feet. "What is the meaning of this?" I cried. "We must ask Captain Nemo," said Conseil. "But where will you find him?" said Ned. "Follow me," I said. We quitted the saloon. There was no one in the library, no one at the central staircase. I fancied that the captain was in the pilot house, so it was better to wait. We therefore returned to the saloon. I pass over the recriminations of the Canadian. I let him exhaust his ill humour at ease without replying. We remained thus for 20 minutes, endeavouring to catch the slightest noise, when Captain Nemo entered. He did not appear to see us. He showed signs of uneasiness. He examined the compass and manometer in silence and placed his finger on a point on the map of the southern seas. I did not like to interrupt him, but as he leaned towards me, I made use of the expression he had used in Torres Strait. "An incident, Captain?" "No, sir," he replied. "An accident this time." "Serious?" "Perhaps." "Is there immediate danger?" "No." "The Nautilus is stranded, I suppose?" "Yes." "And how has it occurred?" "From a caprice of nature, not from our ignorance. No mistake has been made in our course, but we cannot prevent the effects of the laws of equilibrium. We may brave human laws, but not those of nature." This was a curious moment for Captain Nemo to select to give vent to this philosophical reflection, and on the whole, I got little from his reply. "May I know how this incident has come about?" I asked. "A whole mountain of ice has turned over," he replied. "When icebergs get undermined, either by warmth or repeated shocks, the centre of gravity ascends. Then they topple over. That is what has occurred. One of these blocks, as it fell, struck the Nautilus under water. Then, gliding beneath the hull, it raised it with irresistible force, and forced us into thinner ice, where the Nautilus now lies on her side." "But cannot we empty the reservoirs to get her off by those means?" "That is now being done. You can hear the pumps at work. Look at the manometer. It shows that the Nautilus is rising, but the block of ice is rising with it, and until its progress is stopped, our situation will be practically the same." In fact, the Nautilus now gave a bound to leeward. She would right herself, no doubt, when the ice block was separated from her, but at that moment we could not tell whether we might not be crushed up against the iceberg and crushed between the blocks. I kept thinking of this consequence of the situation. Captain Nemo never took his gaze from the manometer. The Nautilus, since the fall of the iceberg, had risen about 150 feet, but at the same angle as before. Suddenly, a slight movement was felt. The vessel was evidently righting a little. The objects suspended in the saloon appeared to be recovering their normal position. The sides got more upright. No one spoke a word. With beating hearts we watched, and felt the ship recovering herself. The floor was at length horizontal. 10 minutes elapsed. "At length we have righted!" I cried. "Yes," said the captain as he advanced to the door. "But are we floating?" I asked. "Certainly," he replied, "since the reservoirs are not empty. When they are empty, we shall rise to the surface again." The captain went out, and I soon found that the ascent of the Nautilus had been stopped. We should soon have struck against the bottom of the iceberg had we gone up, and it was more prudent to remain beneath the waters. "We have escaped very well," said Conseil. "Yes, indeed. We might have been crushed between the blocks of ice, or at any rate imprisoned, and then in the absence of opportunity to renew the air. Yes, we have escaped very well." "If it is all over," murmured Ned. I did not wish to enter on a useless discussion with the Canadian, so I did not reply. Besides, the panels were just then opened, and the exterior light entered. We were in open water, as I have said, but at about 6 yards on each side of the Nautilus rose a dazzling wall of ice. Above and below it was the same. Above us, the lower surface of the iceberg covered us like an immense ceiling, while below, the overturned iceberg, having slipped a little, had found a rest upon the two lateral walls, which kept it in that position. The Nautilus was thus imprisoned in a regular ice tunnel, about 20 yards in length, and filled with still water. It was therefore easy to get out of it by going backwards or forwards, and afterwards make at some 100 yards lower down a free passage beneath the iceberg. The ceiling light had been extinguished, and nevertheless the saloon was brilliantly illuminated. This was the powerful reflection from the glass partitions, caused by the intense light of the electric lamp. I cannot describe the effect of the voltaic rays upon the capriciously shaped ice blocks. Each angle, ridge and facet threw off a different gleam according to the vein of the ice, a sparkling mine of gems, and particularly of sapphires, which crossed their blue rays with the green of the emerald. There were also opal shades of infinite softness coursing amidst brilliant diamond points of fire, whose intense brilliancy the eye could not sustain. The power of the lantern was increased 100-fold, like a lamp through the lenticular sheets of a large lighthouse. "Is it not beautiful?" cried Conseil. "Yes," I said. "It is a magnificent sight, is it not, Ned?" "Yes, confound it, yes it is," replied Ned Land. "It is superb. I am angry at being forced to admit it. Nothing to equal it has ever been seen, but this sight may cost us dear, and if I must say all I think, I believe that we are now looking at things which God never intended man to see." Ned was right. It was too beautiful. Suddenly a cry from Conseil made me turn. "What is the matter?" I cried. "I am blinded, I believe." I turned involuntarily to the window. The vessel was going at a great pace now. I understood what had happened. All the quiet glittering of the icy walls was now changed into flashing lightning. The glare of these myriads of diamonds was absolutely blinding. The Nautilus was sailing through a stream of lightning. The panels were closed. We held our hands before our eyes, still affected by the intense glare. It was some time before our eyes recovered their usual power. At length we removed our hands. "I should scarcely believe such a thing," said Conseil. "I do not believe it now," replied the Canadian. "When we return to Earth," added Conseil, "satiated with all the wonders of nature, what shall we think of the miserable continents and the petty efforts of men? No, the habitable world is not enough for us." To hear such a speech from the impassible Fleming was a proof that some degree of excitement had increased our enthusiasm. But the Canadian did not fail to throw cold water on it. The inhabited world," cried he, nodding his head. "Be easy on that score, friend Conseil. We shall never get there again." It was then 5 a.m. We suddenly felt a shock. I understood that the spur of the Nautilus had struck a block of ice. This must have been caused by a false movement, for the submarine tunnel, encumbered as it was with ice blocks, did not offer very good navigation. I thought, therefore, that Captain Nemo, by changing his course, would turn these obstacles or follow the windings of the tunnel. In any case, our advance could not be entirely stopped, but, contrary to my expectations, the Nautilus went astern again. "We are going back," cried Conseil. "Yes," I replied. "I suppose that there is no outlet this way." "And then?" "Then," I said, "the plan is very simple. We must retrace our steps and get out by the south end. That is all." I spoke thus, so as to appear more confident than I really felt. Meantime, the Nautilus retired at a greater pace, and soon at a very high speed. "This will be a drawback indeed," said Ned. "What can a few hours matter, more or less?" I said, "provided we get out at last." "Yes," said Ned, "provided we do get out at last." For a short time I walked from the saloon to the library. My companions sat down in silence. I soon threw myself upon a couch and took up a book, which I began to read mechanically. After the lapse of a quarter of an hour, Conseil approached and said, "Is that book interesting, monsieur?" "Very interesting indeed," I replied. "I can quite believe it," he said. "It is monsieur's own work that he is reading." "My book!" I exclaimed. But so it was. I was reading The Great Submarine Depths. I had not the slightest idea of it. I closed the book and resumed my walk. Ned and Conseil got up to go. "Stay here, my friends. Let us wait together till we are clear of this ice." "Just as monsieur pleases," said Conseil. Some hours passed. I often consulted the instruments hanging in the saloon. The manometer showed that the Nautilus maintained a uniform depth of 300 yards. The compass showed her on a southerly course. The log that we were going at 20 miles an hour, a great speed in such a confined space. But Captain Nemo knew what he was about, and every minute was worth a century to us. At 8:25, a second shock occurred, astern this time. I turned pale. My companions approached me. I seized Conseil's hand. We looked at each other, and our looks interpreted our thoughts better than words could have done. At that moment the captain entered. I went up to him. "Our course southward is barred?" I asked. "Yes. The iceberg, in turning over, has closed every outlet." "We are blocked up, then," I said. "Yes." That's the end of the chapter, and I want to do one more before we finish, so have a sip of your tea and buckle up. Chapter 16. Want of Air. So, around the Nautilus, above and below, was an impenetrable wall of ice. We were imprisoned in the iceberg. The Canadian struck the table with his heavy fist. Conseil said nothing. I looked at the captain. His face wore its usual look. He was standing with his arms crossed, lost in thought. The Nautilus did not move. The captain roused himself and said in a calm tone, "Gentlemen, there are 2 ways for us to die under present circumstances." He spoke as if he were a professor of mathematics delivering a lecture to his pupils. "The first is to be crushed up. The other is to die by suffocation. I do not speak of the possibility to die of hunger, for the supplies on board will last longer than we can. Let us, therefore, calculate our chances of being crushed or suffocated." "As far as suffocation goes, Captain," I replied, "there is not much fear of that, for our reservoirs are filled." Excuse me. Hiccups, apparently. "Quite so," replied the captain. But they only give us 2 days' supply. Now we have been under water 36 hours, and the atmosphere here requires renovating already. In 48 hours, our reserves will be exhausted." "Well, Captain, we shall be free before that." "We will try, at any rate by piercing the walls around us." "Which side?" I asked. "The sound must guide us. I will run the Nautilus on the lower bank, and my men in their divers' dresses must attack the iceberg at the thinnest spot." "Can they open the windows of the saloon?" "Easily. We are moving no longer." The captain went out. A hissing noise soon told me that the water was entering the reservoirs. The Nautilus sank slowly and rested on the ice at a depth of 350 yards, at which distance the lower pack of ice was immersed. "My friend," said I, "the case is serious, but I count on your courage and energy." "Monsieur," said the Canadian, "I am not going to weary you with complaints at such a time as this. I am ready to do anything for the common safety." "Thank you, Ned," I replied, extending my hand to him. "I may add that I am as handy with a pick as with a harpoon, so if I can be of any use to the captain, I am at his disposal." "He will not refuse your assistance, Ned. Come." I conducted the Canadian to the room where the crew were putting on their diving dresses. I mentioned Ned's suggestion to the captain, who accepted it. The Canadian then put on the dress and was ready as soon as the rest. Each one carried on his back the Ronquerolles apparatus, which furnished a reservoir of pure air. A considerable but necessary deduction had been made from the supply on board. The Ruhmkorff lamps were not necessary. When Ned was dressed, I returned to the saloon, the windows of which were now open. and with Conseil examined the ambient beds which supported the Nautilus. Some moments after, we saw a dozen of the crew on the bank of ice. Ned Land was with them, distinguishable by his great height. Captain Nemo also accompanied the party. Before digging into the ice, he sounded it, so as to be certain of the best direction in which to work. Sounding lines were let into the side walls, but the lead stopped after 15 yards. It was useless to attack the ceiling, since the iceberg was more than 1,200 feet high. Captain Nemo then sounded the lower part. 10 yards of ice separated us from the water. That, then, was the thickness of the ice field. It was therefore necessary to cut out a piece equal to the Nautilus' line of flotation. There were thus about 6,000 cubic yards to detach, so as to give us an opening to descend to the ice field. The work was at once commenced and vigorously prosecuted. Instead of cutting close around the Nautilus, which would have been a difficult operation, Captain Nemo determined to describe an immense trench around it, about 8 yards from the starboard side. Then the men worked with borers at several points of the circumference, and the picks soon went to work and immense blocks were detached. By the curious effect of specific gravity, these blocks, lighter than water, flew, so to speak, to the top of the tunnel, which got as much thicker above as it got thinner underneath. After 2 hours' hard work, Ned Land gave in. His companions and he were replaced by new hands, to whom we were allied. The mate superintended us. The water appeared to me to be very cold, but I soon warmed myself at work. I could move freely, although under a pressure of 30 atmospheres. When I entered the Nautilus, after 2 hours' work, to get some food and repose, I perceived a great difference between the air on board and what had been supplied by the apparatus. The air in the Nautilus had not been renewed for 48 hours, and its vivifying qualities were considerably weakened. But after a lapse of 12 hours, we had only raised a block of ice a yard thick on the marked portion, which was about 600 cubic yards. At this rate, we should take 5 nights and 4 days to finish the task. 5 nights and 4 days, I said to my companions, and we have but 2 days' supply of air in the reservoirs. Without counting, added Ned, that if we ever do get out of this damned prison, we shall still be under the iceberg and without communication with the open air. It was quite true. Who could foresee the minimum of time necessary for our deliverance? Might not we be suffocated before the Nautilus had time to reach the surface again? Were we doomed to perish in this tomb of ice which shuts us in? The situation was terrible, but everyone looked it in the face, and all were determined to do their duty to the end. As I had foreseen, another block, a yard square, was raised during the night, but in the morning, when, clothed in my diving dress, I explored the water in a temperature of 6 degrees or 7 degrees below zero, it seemed to me that the lateral walls were coming closer. The water, at a distance from the trench, not warmed by the presence of the workers, had a tendency to solidify. Our chances of escape were diminished by this discovery. And how were we to stop the solidification of the surrounding water, which, when frozen, would crack the Nautilus like glass? I did not point out this new danger to my companions, for what good was there to diminish their energy in the hard efforts to escape? But when I returned on board, I told Captain Nemo my fears. "I know it," he said, in that calm tone of his, which the gravest danger could not alter. "It is only one danger more, and I do not see any way to avoid it. The only chance of safety is to work quicker than the solidification. We must be first, that's all." We must be first! I had become accustomed to his manner of speech by this time. During that day I wielded a pick vigorously for many hours. This toil sustained me. Besides, to work was to quit the Nautilus and to breathe the pure air supplied by the apparatus, to abandon a vitiated atmosphere. Another yard was dug out by evening. When I returned on board, I was almost choked by the carbonic acid with which the air was saturated. If we had only some chemical appliances with which to get rid of this deleterious gas. We had no want of oxygen. The water contained a very large quantity, and by decomposition we might restore the air. I had thought about it, but it was of no use to attempt it, as the carbonic produced by our respiration had permeated the vessel. To absorb it, we must have some caustic potash, and work it about incessantly. Now we had none of this on board, and nothing else would do. In the evening, Captain Nemo let some fresh air escape from his reservoirs, and without it we certainly should not have lived. Next day, March 26th, I resumed my work in taking out the 5th yard. The sides and the upper ice began to thicken visibly. It was evident they would join together before the Nautilus could escape. Despair seized upon me for a moment, then my pickaxe fell from my grasp. What was the use of cutting away the ice if we were to be suffocated and crushed by the rapidly petrifying water? This was a punishment that even savages had never invented. It seemed to me that we were between the jaws of a monster which were irresistibly approaching. At that moment, Captain Nemo, directing and working by turns, passed near me. I touched his arm and pointed to the side walls of our prison. The wall on the port side had advanced to within 4 yards from the Nautilus. He understood, and made me a sign to follow him. We returned on board. I took off my dress and accompanied him into the saloon. "Monsieur Aronnax," he said, "we must try something desperate, or we shall be sealed up as in cement." "Yes," I said, "but what can we do?" "If the Nautilus were only strong enough to resist the pressure." "Well," I said, not catching the idea. "Do you not understand," he continued, "that this freezing of the water would help us? It would burst through the ice that imprisons us. It can burst the hardest stones when it freezes. We have therefore an agent of safety, not of destruction." "Yes, perhaps so, but the Nautilus could never hold out against this terrible pressure. It would be flattened like an iron plate." "I know it," replied the captain, "so we must only trust to ourselves. We must oppose this solidification. Not only are the lateral walls closing in on us, but there do not remain 10 feet of water either before or behind us. This congelation is gaining on all sides." "How long," I asked, "will the air in the reservoirs permit us to breathe?" The captain looked at me steadily. "After tomorrow," he said, "the reservoirs will be empty." A cold sweat came over me. And yet I ought not to have been surprised at his reply. On the 22nd of March the Nautilus went under water at the pole. We had now reached the 26th. We had lived for 5 days upon the reserve on board, and what air remained respirable must be kept for the working parties. Even now my impression is still so vivid that an involuntary fear seizes me, and my lungs seem to want air. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo was reflecting in silence and motionless. An idea had apparently occurred to him, but he seemed to reject it. At length he said, "Boiling water." "Boiling water!" I exclaimed. "Yes. We are shut up in a space relatively small. Would not streams of boiling water, constantly injected by pumps of the Nautilus, raise the temperature of the water and retard the congelation?" "We must try it," I said resolutely. "Let us do so, Professor." The thermometer showed 7 degrees outside. Captain Nemo led me to the galley where the vast apparatus for distilling drinking water by evaporation were at work. They were filled with water, and the whole power of the electric heat was directed through the serpentines immersed in the liquid. In a few moments it had reached 100 degrees. It was sent to the pumps while fresh supplies came in proportion. The heat was so great that the cold water drawn from the sea after having only passed through the apparatus came boiling to the pumps. The pumping commenced, and in 3 hours the thermometer marked 6 degrees below zero. We had gained a degree. 2 hours after, the thermometer marked 4 degrees. "We shall succeed," said I to the captain, having most carefully watched the progress of the operation. "I think so," he said. "We shall not be crushed, and so have only suffocation to fear." During the night the temperature of the water rose to 1 degree below zero. The injections could not carry it any higher. But as congelation of the sea water is only produced at 2 degrees, I was reassured against solidification. The following day, 27th of March, 18 feet of ice had been cut away. 12 feet only remained. We had still 48 hours to work in. The air could not be renewed in the interior of the Nautilus, so this day would make it worse still. An intolerable weight pressed upon me. About 3 p.m. this feeling of distress affected me in a violent degree. I yawned enough to dislocate my jaws. I panted in endeavouring to inhale the burning fluid so necessary to respiration, and which became more and more rarefied. A mortal torpor oppressed me. I was powerless, almost unconscious. My brave Conseil, similarly affected and suffering as I did, never quitted my side. He took my hand. He gave me encouragement, and I heard him murmur, "Ah, if I were not obliged to breathe, I should be able to leave more air for monsieur." Tears came to my eyes at hearing him speak thus. If our situation all round was so intolerable on board, you can imagine how willingly we donned our diving dresses for work. The blows of the pickaxes resounded on the frozen ice beds. Our arms were aching, the skin was peeling from our hands, but what was fatigue? What did wounds matter? We had air for our lungs. We breathed. We breathed. Nevertheless, no one prolonged his turn under the water beyond his allotted time. His task finished, each one handed to a companion the reservoirs that supplied him with vital air. Captain Nemo set the example, and was the first to submit to this severe discipline. As the time came round, he handed his dress to another, and returned to the vitiated atmosphere on board, calm as ever, without a murmur, unflinchingly. On that day our usual work was accomplished with more than usual vigour. 6 feet only remained to be raised. Only 2 yards separated us from open sea. But the air reservoirs were almost empty. What little remained must be kept for the working parties. Not an atom for the Nautilus. When I returned on board I felt half suffocated. What a night I passed. I do not know how to describe it. Such sufferings are better untold. Next day my breathing was oppressed. A sensation of dizziness oppressed my brain, and I went about like one intoxicated. My companions were affected in the same way, and some of the crew had rattling in the throat. This, the 6th day of our imprisonment. Captain Nemo, thinking the work progressed too slowly with mattock and pick, resolved to crush the bed of ice that separated us from the open water. He had preserved his coolness and energy throughout. He overcame physical pain by moral force. He deliberated. He combined his reasonings and acted. By his order the Nautilus was lightened, that is to say, raised from the ice bed by an alteration in the specific gravity. So soon as it floated it was towed over the top of the circumference of the trench, which had been excavated according to its line of flotation. Then the reservoirs of water were filled. It descended and was engulfed in the hole. Then all the crew came aboard, and the door of communication was shut. The Nautilus was then resting upon a bed of ice, which was about a yard in thickness, and pierced in 1,000 places. The reservoirs were then opened, and 300 cubic feet of water admitted, increasing the weight of the vessel to about 1,800 tons. We waited, we listened, all suffering forgotten in the tension of those moments, hoping still we had thrown our last stake for safety. Notwithstanding the buzzings that filled my brain, I soon heard groanings beneath the hull of the Nautilus. The ice cracked in a curious manner, with a sound like the tearing of paper, and the Nautilus broke through. "We have passed it," muttered Conseil in my ear. I was not able to reply. I seized his hand and pressed it convulsively. The Nautilus, carried down by the enormous weight within, sank like a stone. Then all the electric force was put on the pumps to clear the water out, and in a few minutes our fall was checked. Soon after, the manometer indicated an ascensional movement. The screw, going at full speed, made the vessel tremble, even to its bolts, and we steamed to the north. But how long was his progress beneath the ice to last? Another day? I shall be dead before that. I lay half suffocated upon the divan in the library. My face was blue, my faculties suspended. I saw and heard nothing. All idea of time had left me. My muscles refused to contract. Suddenly I came to myself. Some breaths of the air seemed to penetrate my lungs. Had we gained the surface? Had we cleared the iceberg? No. It was Ned and Conseil, my two brave friends who were sacrificing themselves to save me. Some molecules of air still remained in some of the apparatus, and instead of respiring them, they had preserved them for me, and though almost suffocating, they gave it to me drop by drop. I wished to push the apparatus away. They held my hands, and for a few moments I respired voluptuously. My eyes turned to the clock. It was 11 a.m. It was then the 28th of March. The Nautilus was speeding at 40 miles an hour, tearing through the water. Where were Captain Nemo and his companions? Had they all succumbed? At this moment the manometer indicated that we were only 20 feet from the surface. A simple layer of ice separated us from the atmosphere. Could we not break through it? Perhaps so. In any case, the Nautilus would try. I could feel it assume an oblique position and elevate its spur. The introduction of water was sufficient for this change. Then, impelled by the powerful screw, it attacked the ice field like a formidable battering ram. It broke it by degrees, by retiring and then attacking it with renewed force against the ice field, which gave way, and at last, carried upwards by its impetus, it crushed down upon the icy fragments, which it splintered beneath its weight. The panels were opened, torn open I might say, and fresh, pure air from the sea permeated all parts of the Nautilus once again. And that brings us to the end of this reading for tonight. Thank you. You may now breathe.